Welcome to one of a continuing series of roundtables here at the Aspen Institute. I'm John Carlin, the chair of the Cybersecurity and Technology Program, a new program sponsored by the Aspen Institute focusing on cybersecurity issues. It turns out there are a couple of them that are not resolved. That'll be a surprise to many of you here. And we are very fortunate to have with us here today Rob Joyce, who I got the pleasure of knowing when I was in government as one of, and there are a few in this area who both claim the title of cybersecurity expert, actually know how to code, and have done some of the most complicated operations in the United States government in his long service as a career official at the National Security Agency. And then in his current role as, I believe, the first person who has been both someone who has applied the craft and now is sitting in a policy role as the cyber czar in the current White House and the National Security Council, the most important official in our policy apparatus dealing with cybersecurity issues, who has the unenviable job of wrangling all of the rest of the cats in government who deal with cybersecurity issues. So welcome, Rob, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
We're also fortunate because today there is some breaking news that at our prior Aspen Summit in Cambridge, we had a chance to talk to Rob Joyce about something called the Vulnerabilities Equities Process. And he declared there that for the first time, that document that explains who the agencies are was going to be made public. And today it is being made public as we speak this morning. And so thought I'd start today by getting into that process with you, Rob. And maybe we should start at the beginning with what is the Vulnerability Equities Process?
Great. So pleasure to be here, and thanks to you and the Aspen Institute for hosting us again. The vulnerability equity process, at its most simplest, is the way the government considers the future of flaws it knows about in software or hardware, and making a consideration whether we need to disclose that problem to the vendor for remediation, for mitigation, to be fixed, or whether it's retained for operations. And that actually is a pretty hard debate. It's a sophisticated conversation. It's one the U.S. government's been having for a number of years. It's gone on at NSA inside the dual hat society that lives at NSA for a number of years. And then it was rolled up to an interagency process led out of the White House previously. One of the problems we found with that is that was held as executive privilege. Since it was run out of the White House, there wasn't a lot of detail about the considerations that went into those decisions. There wasn't a lot of information about who was in the room participating. And there wasn't a lot of transparency in just the whole way it was run, up to and including the information flow that was available to overseers. And as we entered into this administration, we felt that we needed a relook at it. And so we've been hard at work for several months, just starting from ground zero at reevaluating that whole process. It didn't change substantially, but it got a lot tighter with the lessons learned from the last couple of years. But the biggest thing today is, as you mentioned, it's the transparency part of it. So we'll be pushing out later today the charter, which includes the departments and agencies that participate, the criteria we use to discuss in the room, and even the considerations when something can't be adjudicated in that group. That's a small edge case, but that's in there as well. So we think this is a really important step forward, and talking about vulnerabilities in that process is a high priority for us.
So you've been doing this for more than a minute. Let's say 10 years ago, explain a little bit, who finds a vulnerability in a software system? I guess it could be software or hardware. Mm-hmm. And then what do you do, what did one do once you found the vulnerability, say 10 years ago?
So the vulnerability work is done in multiple places. It's done at multiple departments and agencies for intel operations, for law enforcement operations, and even now military cyber operations. So those are the capabilities that allow you to manipulate a system for the purposes of achieving those national security goals. It was done in the labs at NSA, CIA, FBI. It was also done at contractors, still is done at contractors. There's places where these vulnerabilities are purchased. And in that process, the discussion was, really what are the considerations for its use, and how is that counterbalanced by the risk to the systems of national security import, of great economic import, or even for political and relationship considerations. It was 10 years ago, much less sophisticated, but it was robust in kind of at least at NSA, in the dual hat nature of the director NSA, had both a protecting national security systems and producing foreign intelligence role.
So just to try to make it a little more concrete for some, so it used to be that different departments and agencies would look at it. They each had their own processes for figuring out what to do with the information if they find that there's a vulnerability. And so when we say vulnerability, it might be just trying to make real for folks why you might tell somebody that essentially their door is unlocked, and why in certain circumstances you would decide, I don't really want to tell said foreign power that they have their door unlocked. I want to use it to gather intelligence. Could you walk through that a little bit?
Sure. So there are people on both ends of this extreme, and what it really takes is a sophisticated conversation. The reasons you want to patch, you want to disclose, are because our society has grown intertwined with our IT technology. We run our government on it. We run military operations using computers and IT technology. We trust the banking industry. We trust the electric power grid to computer control these days. So if there's a flaw in those systems, there is an imperative to close that hole and make sure it's not exploited to the damage of either our economic well-being, our financial well-being, or other purposes. So that's the very strong, real, palpable, and even growing case for disclosing and patching. On the other side of the ledger book, you've got the need to produce foreign intelligence, the need to support warfighters, the need to conduct operations in this new cyber environment. And in fact, a lot of the knowledge we get to defend against systems, our knowledge of who's coming at us, how they're coming at us, the success they're having, is gained from these same sorts of vulnerabilities to be able to do our own cyber operations. And so the key in that is having that robust dialogue about those two ends of the spectrum, because either extreme isn't good for the country. And before these processes existed, we had small pockets who worked in those extremes. You would have an intel agency who would just understand, find flaws, and prosecute them. And you would have defensive entities that were, we must patch everything. And because of this tension, both sides need to come away from that table a little bit unhappy. And I can tell you, chairing those meetings, that's the case, right? We have given up some really exquisite capabilities in the name of making sure our systems are secure. And we've also withheld some capabilities that at the time are justified but needed for the national security process.
So the difference looking back to 10 years ago versus the process that started a couple of years ago was that instead of it being decided by a particular department or agency doing a balancing process, they came together in a room and had to reach agreement?
Yep. So starting a couple years ago, there was a process where the whole interagency came together. Before that time, NSA was the only one with a robust, really strong internal debate about offense and defense with offense and defense experts in the room. Doesn't mean other departments and agencies didn't consider it, but it was rare that that both sides of the equation were represented before the interagency process. So what we've got now is, we've got entities across the interagency who participate, and that was one of the, the smoke-filled rumors about the vulnerability equity process, was whether, certain equities were represented. There was a proposal to add Department of Commerce to the vulnerability equity process. Well, Department of Commerce was already there, right? They represented the commercial equities, the financial equities, and that Treasury was there. If you look at the people that participate.
So let me step forward.
Sure.
So today is the first day, in other words, that you're making public exactly who is in the room making the decision as to whether or not a vulnerability gets disclosed.
That's correct.
And would you mind sharing that with
Sure.
the
And I'm going to look
group?
at my list because it's a big list, and I want to make sure I don't leave anybody out. So we've got DHS to include the National Cybersecurity Communications and Integration Center, so the NCIC, who responds to cyber crises, who are part of NPPD, the National Protection and Platforms Division there.
And so that group has a focus that's more on the defensive side of how to help companies patch or protect their systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And also under the DHS umbrella, Secret Service is in the room because of the importance of protecting the national level comms that serve the president and his ability to communicate in times of extremis. So you can understand they will be a loud voice if there's a vulnerability in a system that potentially could come back against our highest levels of communication. We've got the ODNI in the room as well, to include the Intelligence Community Security Coordination Center, the IC SSC. Department of Treasury is there to understand and represent the banking industry and the concerns in that part. Department of State's in the room. Department of State looks at the diplomatic equities of some of the vulnerabilities and the opportunities that they represent. Department of Justice participates, and that includes both big DOJ to consider the legal equities, and FBI to include the National Cybersecurity Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, so NCI-JTF participates. Department of Energy participates, and DOE is there to really cover critical infrastructure in the power grid. We got to make sure that the equities of the base of our critical infrastructure, which all starts with power, are well represented. OMB is there because OMB, as you know, oversees a lot of the federal cybersecurity FISMA activity and standards for the .gov. DoD is there, and that includes DoD elements for cybercom, DoD policy elements. NSA is there, and NSA includes both their information assurance mission and their foreign intelligence mission. Finally, DoD Cybercrime Center, the DC-3, who does a lot of the forensic investigations of intrusions and understands what's been exploited in that space. I mentioned earlier Department of Commerce is participating. Department of Commerce looks at the commercial equities of this because it impacts not only what are the issues that if a vulnerability were exploited could happen to commercial industry, but what are the equities of the vulnerability if it gets disclosed to a company who made that product, and what are the international considerations for our tech base being able to sell internationally. And then rounding out, we also have CIA, who is a foreign intelligence producer and operates in the cyber domain as well. So that's a pretty robust list. It's never been laid out as plainly and clearly in that role. But as you can see, there's a wide variety of opinions and viewpoints that come in the room And, oftentimes we reach quick consensus. Other times, it really is a hard-fought debate where, people don't see eye to eye.
Let me ask you, so you've described before that you're worried in some respects, given our vulnerabilities, how many attackers there are out there, nation states ranging from Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, to organized criminal groups, and you've described that you're worried about the American public being like a frog getting boiled in a pot when it comes to cybersecurity. So given that dangerous world out there, let me back up one. Is there any other country in the world that has a process that you know of, like the vulnerabilities equity process, where when the intelligence agencies discover a vulnerability, you have a bureaucratic discussion as to whether or not to disclose it, and that you end up disclosing many of those vulnerabilities?
Yeah. So I do think there are a few others. We've exposed this process to the Five Eyes
Can you
countries.
explain who the Five Eyes is?
So the Five Eyes are the U.S., the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Several of them have recently announced their own internal equities process. But I believe ours is the most sophisticated. It's certainly the most practice tested and experienced. But I also don't know of any other nation that really has this sophisticated discussion and is passing, who has these offensive capabilities and is passing vulnerabilities to the vendors to be fixed, right? If I talk to the big name West Coast Silicon Valley firms, they are not getting tips from Russia, China, North Korea, Iran about the vulnerabilities they've chosen to patch. It just doesn't happen. So I think we're not at either end of that spectrum, patch everything or exploit everything. There's a lot of countries over in the exploit everything bin. There are no countries who are in the patch everything bin. But I think the level of dialogue and the input that goes into our decisions is just outstanding.
And what, could you give us a sense, how many of these exploits that are discovered are communicated to the private sector or the .gov regime to be able to be fixed?
Yeah, the vast majority are communicated. We're more than 90% disclosing through this process. One of the things we're going to have as a result of this recharter is annual reports at the unclassified level. There's classified exposure and reports to Congress, but there'll also be an understanding of what I'll call the goes intas and goes outas. So how many vulnerabilities were considered, how many were disclosed, and how many were retained. Another key point is when a vulnerability is retained, it's not a lifetime waiver. We have a 6-month window. Every retained vulnerability is re-reviewed every 6 months at a minimum to be sure the conditions are still the same or similar to when we made that decision. And that's really important, right? There's rumors of this vast stockpile. I read articles, so the reporters in the room, please help me. Hoards and stockpiles should not be words that are in your articles. Factually inaccurate. So the concept is we need to push these out. We review them, and in some cases, we've shortened the review period to less than 6 months as a group, saying we're really divided on this. Let us try it for a couple months in operations and find out the value versus the risk, and come back and re-talk about it in a month or 3 months. And we've done that in the past.
Explain to me, so in a world where the adversaries, the Chinas, the Russias, the North Koreas, are not sharing when they discover a vulnerability, and getting back to the kind of area of risk that we currently live in, where knowing those capabilities is very important, why is it a good idea to have over 90% of the vulnerabilities that you find to be disclosed?
I think it's important because, as we discussed, so much of the fabric of our society rests on the bedrock of our IT. We continue to digitize things. We store our wealth and treasure there. We run operations. We keep our secrets all in that cyber domain. And so it's got to be a first principle that we can trust it. And to trust it is a hard activity that requires both our ability to produce intelligence and find the criminals and drive out some of the criminal behavior, at the same time locking it down so that nobody can get in.
And let me flip it for you then. And why should so you've just said it's not hoarding of stockpiles, but the government is still keeping a certain number of vulnerabilities that the government knows about, but the private sector doesn't, so they can't go and fix it. And if you could explain a little bit why that would be a good idea. And secondly, and linked, there's been a lot of reporting these days and concerns raised by some of the private companies that the government's incapable of protecting those secrets about vulnerabilities, in which case they end up being exposed and used against the companies by bad guys. So if that's the case, again, why is it a good idea for the government to be holding on to these rather than just sharing them the minute they find them?
Yeah. So I've talked some about the why, right? We need these capabilities to protect our troops in combat, produce the intelligence that guides the leadership decisions of the nation, to prosecute in criminal spaces. We need these capabilities often to find the people who are also making our systems insecure. So that's the tactical leg up. As far as protecting, absolutely. We must have the ability to protect and withhold government secrets. And in those secrets are the tools and capabilities that are used in these cyber operations. So I expect the departments and agencies to do world-class work to protect both from insider threat and technical threat, the vulnerabilities that we know about.
And as the cyber czar, how are we doing? Are you comfortable with where we are on protecting our systems from insiders and from cyber attacks?
Well, I think there's some notable examples of where we failed. But I also think that if you look at what the departments and agencies have done and are doing, we've been a really learning community in shoring up the flaws and errors of the past. So I do have confidence that we can protect that data.
And are there any initiatives that you're driving to work on better protecting that type of information, vulnerability information?
Yeah, so I think the executive order EO 13800 that President Trump signed it is laying that framework. It set forth a huge number of tasks for departments and agencies to look at how they secure and operate their systems, where their risks are. Each individual agency, more than 100 departments and agencies, had to go in and report out on their risk profile and where they are accepting risks on purpose. Sometimes that can be because they feel that an older system needs to remain in operation, but it has known flaws. Or it may be that they don't have sufficient budgetary resources to move to what they know is a more secure platform. Regardless, those things had to be laid out, and the department and agency heads signing and issuing those reports out so they can be held accountable. It also gave them a vehicle to talk to and ask for budgetary relief to do the things they need to do to drive those risks down, and that's the number one activity. So you'll see a lot of work underway to go to shared services, because we feel, when you get more than 100 departments and agencies, each individually trying to manage and secure, sometimes against really high-end nation-state attacks, they aren't all equipped, resourced, or experienced enough to do that. And so getting them to manage services where we can have the best technology, the best defenders put against those issues, that'll raise the bar for security. We're also seeing that, that the idea that we can have shared services in the security domain, like a security operations center, having an individual security operations center where each individual operations center has to pay attention to every vulnerability, every new flaw that's been released, every new attack vector, every new patch that comes out. That's hard. And so by professionalizing and aggregating, we get that knowledge at scale. And knowledge at scale equals speed. And for the cyber domain, we've got to move at cyber speed. It can't be at government memo speed.
I thought government memos were written quickly. What are you saying, Rob? There sure are a lot of them if they're written slowly. Getting back to the vulnerabilities equities process, what's the role of Congress? Do they have any role at the end of the day if there's a decision made to either share or not share vulnerability?
So they don't get involved in the individual share, not share. But with the new reporting, with the open charter, what this allows is the departments and agencies who are involved in this process to be accountable to the committees of jurisdiction in this. So this opens the discussion for the departments and agencies to talk about their role in this, to talk about the data that we're supplying. So there'll be a much more comprehensive set of oversight applied. And Congress has the leeway to look at what we're doing, and in that oversight decide if it is or isn't sufficient. Right? There was a discussion of legislating this process. I'm hoping this meets and covers the needs and gets us there faster and more agilely. There's a lot of things in Congress that we need legislation for. I believe the VEP charter covers down on the gaps and holes that they were talking about addressing.
And there's been some discussion both with WannaCry, NotPetya, and then just some general reporting that says essentially that companies today are getting hit by the most sophisticated hacking tools based on secret vulnerabilities combined with the best of NSA know-how in order to target companies. And I'm hearing from clients now who've been advising on cybersecurity, what's the point? There's no way I can defend myself against essentially a zero-day exploit or the NSA. What do you have to say to those who say that a WannaCry or NotPetya is really the result of government research and there's nothing they can do to protect themselves?
I think the big thing to understand is, those two destructive worms were the results of criminals, right? They're the creation of somebody who intended to take piece parts available around the internet, put them together, and use them to damage. The vulnerabilities themselves that mattered in those cases, NotPetya spread because of credential stealing. There's a very simplistic way to scrape credentials. It's known as Mimikatz, is the technical tool that was embedded in there. That's what really allowed the propagation. So it's a criminal act done with intent to damage. I don't think you bring it back around here. I won't talk to the connection to government pieces, but I think people in the tech industry who look at where the damage was done, it was, again, going back to your term, the basic blocking and tackling that companies need to protect against the initial attack vector, which was, in the case of NotPetya, was a compromised watering hole attack against a Ukrainian tech server.
Can you just explain what a watering hole attack is?
So a watering hole attack is, everybody's going to come to one place, right? It's the Serengeti watering hole. The predators will stake out the watering hole and attack those that come there. So in the case of this event, somebody looked at a Ukrainian tax service and said, people are going there, they're the folks I want to get at. I'm going to compromise that server, and then I'm going to have it distribute my malware. And so that's the initial attack vector for that NotPetya. And then once it got in systems, it looked at the credentials of the system it landed on and said, hey, can I spread using the credentials that are here? It could, and it did, to great damage at times.
And what about WannaCry?
Similar, it had a number of propagation methods. In that, I think the biggest thing to know about WannaCry is it was talked about as ransomware. It wasn't. There was no way to unransom your systems in that. It was a capability that was intended to cause disruption and did.
Any updates on the assessment of who did it with either WannaCry or NotPetya?
I'm not going to jump out there in this forum. Thanks.
More news to make today?
No, we got our one big. I'm not going to steal the win from the vet.
All right, and then I'm going to ask one other line and then open it up for some questions. But I've noticed out in the private sector as well that there's some confusion about this discussion, the discussion of vulnerabilities that might get exploited by an intelligence agency and so-called 702, or the statute authorizing the government to collect. Could you explain a little bit what the difference is, and then we'll dive more deeply into 702.
Yeah, so the vulnerabilities process is looking at the capabilities that will enable technology for both defensive or offensive capabilities. It really is the building blocks that go into a wide variety of cyber operations in the government. 702 is an authority that allows collection. So there's the difference between a capability and an authority. For 702, the important thing to understand is why do we need it? What it is set out to do is to cover down in a gap in our authorities for when the intelligence community knows that the target of a foreign intelligence investigation is located overseas, but may be using domestic IT infrastructure to communicate. So, a good example is if we have ISIS terrorists who happen to choose a US email provider. There was a time where, because they were overseas, believed to be foreign, we would talk to the FISA court and say, we need a warrant because their comms are going through this US service provider. And the FISA court said, I don't have jurisdiction. It's not a US person. It's a person believed to be foreign and overseas. And so I don't have jurisdiction to actually compel the collection. We'd try to go to the service provider and compel that collection, and they would say, I want to support, but I can't turn that data over because of the intercept rules. It's being collected on US soil. And so there was a gap in the authorities in that space. The 702 authority was set up to close that gap, giving jurisdiction to be able to issue a legal instrument to those providers and say, we've got a known target overseas for foreign intelligence. The collection needs to be done on US soil. Please bring me those communications. Please provide them under court supervision, under an authorized program, subject to tremendous oversight to include the agencies doing the collection, the IGs involved in that, to include Congress, a rigorous oversight component. And it's been a really powerful tool. We are blessed that the US has tremendous access to the internet. We've got tremendous innovations in the providers that provide services here in the US. And so making sure that there's not a gap when foreigners are creating a national security threat, that they get safe harbor in the US simply because they've chosen a US provider. That's what it's intended to cover down. That's why reauthorization of 702 is so important. And it's had tremendous operational success in the counterterrorism world, in the counter-cyber world, and other areas.
When does it expire?
It sunsets at the end of the year. So we're up against the end of the year congressional deadline.
And what would happen if it expires?
We go deaf and blind to foreigners communicating using U.S. service providers. And if you think about those big services provided through the U.S., that is a tremendous gap in our understanding of the threats against the nation if we go dark on that.
It's November.
It's November.
So what's going on on the Hill.
Yep. So Congress has been attentive. They've been working hard. I think we got past several months ago. We got past the point of whether we should have 702 or not. I think we've got good support on the Hill. Right now, we're debating about the edges of how it will be executed. The administration really was asking for a clean reauthorization, saying it's not broken, don't fix it. There's been some discussion about whether we need warrants on the back end of the 702 collection to look at the outputs of that collection. So from the federal government operational side, there are times when we have targeted foreign overseas intelligence targets. They've resulted in collection that is now collected in the databases of the government. And the question is, what can we look at the outputs of that legitimate, lawful collection for? And the courts have already ruled that it's reasonable in both other foreign intelligence cases and some criminal cases to be able to go in and query that already collected material. So let me give you an example. We had the heinous incident up in New York City where a foreigner here on a visa got into a vehicle and ran down innocent people on the street, right? They were killed and maimed, in what appears to be an act done on behalf of ISIS. So as soon as local law enforcement and the FBI got a hold of that guy, understood his identity, the first thing the FBI wants to know is this part of one of many simultaneous attacks that are going to occur today, right? They're immediately thinking about, is this one piece of a larger activity? And so you want to bring all tools available to understand the scope and breadth of that threat. One of the things that will happen today is they will take the phone numbers and the emails from that person as soon as it's understood, and they'll run it against the collected 702 data. So this is not a blanket collection against that terrorist who just committed that act. It is collection against things that have already been collected from known terrorists. So I, Rob Joyce, citizen of the US, want my government to be able to connect those dots. Remember the hearings we had, the vilification about not having the left hand know what the right hand is doing. So if NSA has targeted foreign terrorists in Syria and Iraq, and they have collected information, and at the time of a new attack here domestically, we need to be able to look at that collection that's already in our holdings to know if Saipov, who is at the time of his attack was considered a U.S. person, even though he's a foreigner. He was on U.S. soil, so he's granted the protections of our Constitution in the FISA Act. So we would take, even though he's a U.S. person at that point in time, we would take and run against the 702 data to see if Saipov, who just killed those people, was ever in communication with a known terrorist overseas. And if he was, who else was? Because then we could see if there was a larger conspiracy underway. That's what we're talking about. Some of the discussion on the Hill would like to go and issue a court order to be able to do that query into the already collected 702 material. And operationally, we don't find that viable. The idea that you've got to then go get the facts of the case, write them in such a way that you justify a foreign intelligence nexus, that you have to get it through the process in an agency, over to DOJ, through the process and lawyers there. I know you were part of that, John. And as fast as it can go, there's still a lot of stops in between. Then you've got to get it before a judge who will hear these things on an emergency basis and get them out. That's not a robust system in an emergency. And then it has a chilling effect on the day-to-day activity of terrorism activities, right? So if we've got somebody and they are suspect in a CT investigation, I want them run against all of the foreign intelligence collection overseas that NSA knows about to see if they have a link, right? These are the things we're trying to preserve in looking for the reauthorization of 702. Those are the things that are hotly debated, and I'm hoping that we'll get some good language out of the Hill that considers these things and really doesn't walk us back from and rebuild the wall between law enforcement and intelligence that we learned hard lessons about after 9/11.
Let me open it up to questions from the audience.
Just curious, Mr. Joyce, as we're talking about the Saipov case, was that same protocol used during the investigation into the Las Vegas shooting? Because early on, no one sort of knew what the motive was and where this came from, and if there was more to it, and if there were contacts with someone overseas. So was that same process used in that case?
So I know all the tools at the government's disposal, all the authorities we had were brought into the Las Vegas case. Anytime you use those tools and you get back a non-answer, it doesn't mean that there's not a threat. So, those are the hardest considerations when somebody is a complete lone wolf and we can't make a tie. At that point, you're still left wondering, have we missed something? Is there somebody they're communicating with who is indeed an overseas controller, a conspiracy overseas, but we're not subject to our knowledge at that point? In Las Vegas and New York, to the best of my knowledge, but we don't at the White House have full transparency into the ongoing cases at DOJ. To the best of my knowledge, we've not found those connections.
Let me do one follow-up. Why? So there's a shooting, people are dead, you're trying to figure out who did it and why. You were hitting on this a little bit. Why is it valuable to see whether or not they've been in contact with people reasonably believed to be foreign terrorists or foreign spies overseas, even if that washes out, even if there's no data?
You can't leave loose ends, right? And the reason it's important is, the power of metadata. The ability to find out there's a nexus between somebody who just committed an act and somebody who, for some reason, was under intelligence surveillance. At that point, you really want to double down on that nexus and find out, are there other active tendrils, and to start to look for co-conspiracy.
And is the negative helpful, though? Finding that it's not there when you're trying to figure out where to put investigative resources?
It is. You will rebalance your cases based on the best available leads. And so being able to shed some of those leads in a world of finite resources gets you the farthest, the fastest. Yeah, great job.
Question here.
Hi, I'm Tara McKelvey, and I work for the BBC. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about diplomatic equities when you talked about these discussions that you have and how it works in terms of global politics or relations with other nations.
Yeah, so certainly. So some of the things we discuss, the vulnerabilities may be on a foreign manufacturer's equipment. It still may be used in U.S. critical infrastructure. And so there's considerations there of, the U.S. government knew about something that was the product of a foreign nation and didn't disclose. It's the same tension we have with our own domestic manufacturers. There's other considerations at times. We do have intelligence and law enforcement cooperation with other nations. And, if we have previously shared a capability with another nation, and now we've chosen to disclose it, we impact not only our own capability, but theirs. And so, while we're careful with their equities, some equity that we own, we have to consider the impacts to those foreign nations as well.
Good. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering how many, under the San Bernardino case, we had it's actually a little unclear whether it was a 0-day or a tool used by a contractor that included
I'm
a
sorry, I
0-day.
missed the beginning of your question.
So the question is about the 0 days that are provided by contractors and whether or not they go through the VEP process.
Yes.
If you've got something that's under an NDA, I'm wondering how many vulnerabilities never make it through the VEP process and aren't considered. And a second part of the question is related to the Eternal Blue. How many of those 0 days in that stockpile that shadow brokers stole?
See, you used the stockpile word.
Sorry.
So,
Well, I mean, it's a large cache of, I'm talking
I'm
about.
not going to talk about tools that allegedly came from the U.S. government, but I'm happy to take the first part of your question.
But the second part with the Eternal Blue, though, was that the NSA, once those tools were out there, the NSA did disclose to Microsoft so that it could be patched. And I'm wondering, was that a VEP decision or was that a unilateral decision by the NSA once those were out in the open? And then what is the government doing to detect going forward when a government 0-day has been unleashed or obtained by an unauthorized party?
Great set of questions, and you hit one line that I should have talked about earlier, which are the exceptions or what comes to the VEP, what doesn't come to the VEP. So purchased vulnerabilities as well as U.S. government discovered vulnerabilities all come to the VEP. There are cases where a purchased vulnerability was done on a non-exclusive contract, meaning that the government legally wouldn't have the ability to disclose it based on the contract it was purchased on. In the past, so this is one of the improvements we've made, in the past, department and agency would just have to assert that they couldn't disclose it anyways and it wouldn't come to the VEP. Today, we have reworked the charter that says if you have a vulnerability that cannot be disclosed because of a contractual reason or an international agreement, that you still have to tell every member of the VEP that you've invoked the exception, and you have to bring it to the chair of the VEP, who is the cybersecurity coordinator at the White House, and reveal all of the details. The cybersecurity coordinator under the new charter has the authority to convene a small group to discuss it if there's an issue with withholding that, right? So that gives us a framework and a set of oversight and insights we never had. So one, it gives us a feedback loop of, how many times people have chosen to invoke an exception. And if somebody's abusing it because it seems they've written their contracts that way, then the whole interagency will understand. I certainly will have that visibility to an even greater extent. We've also included in the charter that departments and agencies are discouraged from those vehicles. So we should be structuring any engagement with commercial entities going forward to purchase with the ability that we wholly own and can disclose if we need to. So that was thing one in your set of questions. Thing two, I mentioned, I'm not going to talk about Eternal Blue and any alleged connections to the government, but I can talk about the process and the way it would work. So if there was a vulnerability that was discovered to have been lost, or we see that it's been discovered by another nation and maybe used in the wild, that is new information and would trigger a reevaluation of any previous decisions. And most likely, highly likely, that if we understood that an exploit that was out of control and known and used elsewhere, it would trigger a release. Right? And then finally, in that space of whether we know or wouldn't know, one of the considerations you'll see in the charter in deciding to retain a vulnerability is the discussion of would we know if somebody else was using this. And so we use SIGINT, HUMINT, and other techniques. We sometimes at places where we're well instrumented, like the Department of Defense networks, will actually deploy and look for these capabilities to understand if somebody's trying to turn them. So we have early sensing and warning. Some cases it is not possible for us to understand that it's being used, but in some cases it is, but it's our intention that that's discussed with every vulnerability. Would we know if somebody else acquired it, rediscovered it, and would we see it being used? So great set of questions.
Ma'am?
Hi, I'm Ann Weigel with Communications Daily, and I've been following the progress of the surveillance legislation in Congress. And yesterday, Attorney General Sessions seemed to indicate he would be continuing discussions, but this was in the House Judiciary Committee, which, as you know, has passed the USA Liberty Act. I'm curious how hard the administration will push for a clean and permanent reauthorization, or do you expect there'll be some compromise?
Yeah, there will be a compromise. The point we're at now, it's clear a clean and permanent reauthorization. If you look at what the Senate put forward, what House Judiciary put forward, what's still being discussed in House Intel, I think there's going to be something in the changes. So, we're trying to provide technical support to the folks that are doing drafting so that we get the best possible bill.
All right. Sir?
Mark Line from the VA. And it's great to have you here, and thank you very much. This discussion can go on all day, and it will go on for many years to come with your administration's leadership. The President's strengthening cybersecurity order builds upon and I think enhances the previous administration's cybersecurity plan. Included in the plan and the foundations going forward is the Underwriters Laboratories Cybersecurity Assurance Program. In cooperative research and development, we're leading a collaboration, VA, Underwriters Laboratories, for medical device cybersecurity standards, looking at the vulnerabilities and threats for medical devices that our veterans, most dearly prioritized. This focuses on the Internet of Things and medical devices connected to our veterans networks. Mm-hmm. Can you comment about healthcare and devices and cybersecurity?
Yeah. Well,
thanks.
I think when you look at any critical infrastructure, and healthcare is considered part of our critical infrastructure, we've got to make sure it's robust. The Internet of Things is connecting devices at a scope and scale never before seen. And unfortunately, some of those devices are being built without the best considerations for how they're deployed with security and how they're maintained in an environment where you need to update and patch them. So we're hoping through the work of the executive order, through some good engagements with the commercial industry, to drive the IoT ecosystem to adopt some basic security fundamentals, to include that it's secure by default, that it doesn't come with default passwords that could be exploited, that it has the ability to be updated, that the best devices will sign their firmware and update over an encrypted channel so they can't be exploited during deployments, and that the manufacturer commits to supporting them for a reasonable period of time. Those kind of things will make the ecosystem so much better, and so we're looking for ways to encourage good market forces to adopt those activities.
Rob, last time you were with us, you said you try to make the vulnerability equity process transparent in about a month, and you're back to do it. Any time frame on when we might expect an announcement of a structure or a framework to make the Internet of Things more secure as it goes forward?
Yeah, I've learned unless you're really at the edge of delivering something, you don't make promises on policy deliverables. We do a lot of coordination. If you look at the folks that have an element of cyber across the U.S. government, it's just a wide and diverse group of folks. So coordination's difficult.
Given the urgency of the Internet of Things problem, is that an area where you think there should be congressional action? Are we doing enough fast enough?
Yeah, so I know Congress is talking about some innovative things. We got to strike that balance between innovation and regulation or innovation and law. One of the challenges we have in cybersecurity regulation or law is all the multiple overlapping jurisdictions. If you've got a company that wants to do business and each state has their own law, the federal government has a law, you might have multiple regulators inside those various states and even multiple federal regulators, and then you start to get to the international marketplace. It's really a challenge for both the equipment manufacturers, the operators, and folks who are trying to do the right thing, because at times, depending on the jurisdiction they're in, they can get competing regulations that tell them to do the exact opposite things. So we're mindful of that. We'd like to use good market forces to drive things rather than regulation, but there are probably places where regulation and even above that law is needed.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Gopal Ratnam. I'm a reporter with Congressional Quarterly. I want to ask you a little bit about the process in the vulnerabilities, equities, decision-making. In cases where the agencies decide that some of the known vulnerabilities will be retained for exploitation purposes, what is the process for, is there any kind of a risk assessment? For example, if that vulnerability is known to someone else and they decide to exploit, what the costs would be for users of that particular software or infrastructure? I just want to see if you can talk a little bit more about that process.
Yeah. So there are a lot of considerations, and I would encourage you to read as we put out the charter. We've specifically outlined the considerations that go into the discussion, and the cost equities of that are part of that discussion. Things as broad as how widely is the product used, how broad is the range of product versions that are impacted. Is this ubiquitous across the product or specific to one version? Do we believe that other actors would exploit it? Things like what kind of access do you need to exploit it? There are some things where if you can touch the device, you can exploit it, but from around the world, remotely, you can't. That has a consideration in it. And we do debate some what I will call art, not science components of it, like how likely is it that others will be able to discover the same thing? So, the U.S. government has broad experience over decades of working vulnerabilities and exploits and doing defensive activities. So we've got a fair amount of expertise to understand when we've discovered something, if it's been rediscovered in the wild. And there's been some academic studies on that, but I will tell you, in our experience, the kinds of vulnerabilities and the techniques we use to find them, the types of things that are useful for us to retain, are rarely ever rediscovered by anybody else. We do see them routinely patched and fixed, but not because they were fixing the issue. It's more likely that the company has decided to re-architect that segment that had a flaw, or the company has changed their development environment to use better software practices that locks out the capability we had. Overall, the ecosystem's tending better and better, making better and better software. That's good for all of us, and we want to keep encouraging that. It's that understanding of where are those subtle nuances that can be exploited, and how likely is it that someone else will find it, that are often debated.
David? And then
Thanks very much. David Sanger from the New York Times, and thanks, Rob, for doing this. As journalists, we struggle sometimes to come up with an example that would explain to readers what this actually looks like. And the Microsoft case that was referred to in an earlier question gives us one, because Microsoft itself has made public what happened, what they did. I think it was March. They said that the NSA came to them, presented a vulnerability. They then patched it. Now, it wasn't patched in time, perhaps, to cause the kind of trouble that may have been wrapped up in, but it was in the end patched. So I'm wondering if you can just go back and use that as an example of the VEP process here for us.
Yeah, I'm
And-
sorry, David, I'm not going to go into the alleged government connections to any of those activities. I've got lawyers in the room. And
Okay.
They know,
Let me
They know
make
where
the,
I live.
Let me make the question a little more generic then for you.
Sure.
Do you have moments where you have had vulnerabilities that you found and retained, and then had to go turn around and go to a manufacturer and say, look, we've retained this for X period of time. We think this is now getting out into the world. We need your help to go patch it in a hurry. And what lessons have you learned from that process? Would it have been better to do it earlier in retrospect, or do you think that that process actually works pretty well?
Yep, so happy to answer the generic question. We have had examples where something that we have retained has been disclosed or discovered. And so at that point in time, we have a pretty expedited process to begin the dialogue with the company. It varies a lot as to how that dialogue's gone. There are cases, and you'll see in the considerations of retain or release, one of the things we talk about is a company likely to patch? So we have had some interesting anecdotes over the years where we've gone to the companies and told them, here's a flaw, it needs to be fixed in your device. And they've said, that's great, but we're telling customers they need to buy our new shiny next generation thing, right? And so they have no intention of patching their old equipment. In that case, pay attention to the DHS advisories that come out, right? So we're advising people about insecurities of equipment that's no longer supported and upgraded from manufacturers. We've also had examples where we've gone to a company and told them about a flaw, and the company's response was, that's not a flaw, that's a feature. And they have no intention of fixing. And again, pay attention to your DHS advisories as to how to configure or not use that device. So, we have channels and means to get that information out. We also have, worked with manufacturers who have rapidly issued patches and updated systems. And, we're still seeing years later, both domestically, despite the company, despite the advisories to patch and upgrade, we're still seeing vulnerable machines, vulnerable software in use. So that's another of the examples of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So it's a wide and vast array of experiences. We have, as I said, evolved this charter based on the lessons of the last couple of years running the VEP. We've streamlined the process for disclosure so that if we make a decision that we've got to disclose, one, if there's urgency, there's a light process where if it's really, no kidding, going to be uncontentious and easy, we can run that through very fast and then reach out to a company rapidly. And we've also streamlined the process to just get more sophisticated discussion on both ends of the arguments as input to make better decisions.
Okay, follow up on that while we go back to Sean in the corner there. So I've heard, so some clients are have the interest private sector because they're the ones who make the software, and that's who it sounds like gets told in the first instance there's a vulnerability. I've also heard from those who are relying on those companies, and their complaint is, why is it on me, hospital or manufacturer, if someone sold me a defective product, why do they get to choose whether or not they act on your warning? Can't someone tell me directly or order them to fix it? And curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the order to fix is a little beyond the way our commercial free enterprise works and the way I would want my government directing private entities.
Although if it's a car,
Yep.
you can recall it and force it to be fixed. So there are some places where it's directed. Do you think there's a role for that type of process when it comes to vulnerabilities in software or
Yeah,
hardware?
I think there are some, certainly in healthcare is a good example, right? FDA regulates pacemakers and computer-controlled technologies that are going to be used in areas that will pose a threat to life. And so they have the ability to regulate and oversee that. So there are places in our electric power grid and certainly in the nuclear plants. Department of Energy has the strong ability and tools to be directive in that region. When you look at what should the company be able to control about what they do or don't do, I am a huge advocate of auto updates and the ability for the companies rather than the consumers to decide when they should upgrade. There's a wide array of views on the risk that involves. Over time, I've become convinced that in the majority of the applications, so certainly in our personal lives, in the business systems, the idea that an upgrade may cause a crash or a flaw itself is usually completely outweighed by the need to protect. And so I think auto patching, in many areas makes sense, and that ought to be the default, especially as we move into like IoT devices and other things. The number of computers in our life, the number in any given room, far outstrips our ability to administer them as individuals. And so certainly in the consumer environment, it just needs to happen in the background without you thinking about it.
I think we have one more question. Time for one more?
Yeah, Sean Waterman, reporter. Mr. Joyce, given what you said about the Internet of Things and the question earlier about the VA and their work with, why wasn't FDA in the room? Why isn't FDA going to be in the room on the equities process? I mean, I don't see any health agencies on that list, and I mean, given the particular sensitivity of medical devices.
So that's a great question. I have the charge to look out for their equities, and several in the room look out for them as well. It really comes down to the ability to have cleared individuals with a background to participate robustly in that dialogue. As you expand any group, as the numbers increase, it gets less and less effective. So we had to make a decision point as to where we had well represented the equities on both sides of the debate, and people who could cover on critical infrastructure. DHS is there, who has the role for critical infrastructure writ large. The sector-specific agencies are represented in a couple small cases. Health and Human Services, VA, and things like that are not. But health equities are part of the discussion that happens at that.
Apparently, we have time for one more from Ellen in the front row, and then we really have to wrap. And thanks again, Rob, for being so generous with your time today.
Thank you, Rob, and I really appreciate the transparency, your efforts at bringing transparency to this process. So I wanted to just ask you a question on your comment about how the ecosystem is improving, and some of the hackers or individuals I've spoken to who actually are in this sort of work say that it is becoming more difficult to actually find these vulnerabilities. So do you expect, as this ecosystem improves, I mean, are you finding even now that there are fewer and fewer vulnerabilities that are coming to the table to bring to the VEP? Do you expect that trend to continue? And how will that impact both sides of the ledger, both your efforts to exploit for foreign intelligence and to increase cybersecurity for all?
Yeah. I don't think fewer vulnerabilities will come to the fore. They're needed for operations, and the government is going to work to develop. It's just a fact. The government is going to work to develop vulnerabilities and understand and find them for operations. It is true that that the vulnerabilities of old are being stamped out by good practices and good processes. But the ecosystem continues to find new and innovative ways to exploit. When you look at the criminal factor, when you look at the nation states, the benefits of finding a flaw are such that people are going to work to develop them. So there's going to continue to be flaws in our system.
All right. I wanted to thank again both you for your questions today, but Rob Joyce for his service to the country over years. And I think you can tell from his thoughtful answers today how lucky we are to have him in his current perch. So please join me in giving him a warm applause. Thanks, Rob.